Today on The Global African, we'll talk about the murder of 3 Muslims that took place in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We'll also address comments made by President Raul Castro on the issue of reparations for the Caribbean. That and more today on The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. We'll be right back, so don't go anywhere. When I received word of the killings of the 3 Muslims in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, I was stunned. I was stunned by the brutality of what was in effect an execution. And I was stunned also by the failure of the mainstream media to immediately pick up on this and give it great coverage. We all knew that had it been 3 white Christians that were executed by a Muslim, that it would have been all over the mainstream media. Yet it did not take place until there was a Twitter upsurge. How do we explain that? How do we explain the White House's delay in issuing any kind of statement? What is the larger context? That's what we're going to explore today in The Global African, so stick with us. Joining us for our discussion is Eddie Conway, a former leader of the Black Panther Party in Baltimore. He was imprisoned and was released after 43 years and 11 months in March of 2014. He's currently a producer at the Real News Network. Also joining us is James Early, an African, Caribbean, and Latin American scholar and member of the board for the Institute of Policy Studies. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Chapel Hill.
Yes. Well, as always, when there are incidents involving like white males shooting, mass shootings, it's always a mentally imbalanced individual with a history of family problems, parent abuse, etc. And it's always portrayed like that, you know, even down to the Twinkie defense or fluency.
Right.
But when it's any other group of people, whether it's a black people or Muslims, etc., it's always considered either terrorism or a barbaric act that is a affront to society. And I think in Chapel Hill, you have that situation again. It plays out time and time and time again, whether it was with dragging James Byrd behind a car. It was always like, okay, well, this is just an exception to the rule. We don't act that way, right. You know. I think a lot about that, Eddie, because I remember, you know, when after 9/11. Well, no, let me go back. 95, Oklahoma City bombing. The first reaction was the assumption that it was Muslims that had carried out the attack. Once they found out it was a good old white boy, then all of a sudden the entire discussion shifted to trying to understand what would motivate this soldier, former soldier, to have carried out such an act. And then 9/11 happens. No one tried to psychoanalyze Muhammad Atta. Yeah.
Right? No one tried to psychoanalyze any of the terrorists. It was just using that as a blanket way of condemning, you know, Arabs and Muslims. James?
3 Muslim American citizens, born and reared in the United States, raised in the Chapel Hill area, shot down in cold blood, shot blank in the head. It is characteristic of a number of things that we've just alluded to that go across the country. This does represent a racist culture, but other American citizens, black, white, green, polka dot, when you've got a culture of racism and you associate with someone who doesn't fit the official profile of what an American citizen looks like, what they wear, how they talk, you too are in danger for simply being associated with your neighbors. That's right. And so this is how I think we should look at the terror of culture. It's a long-standing Ku Klux Klan terror. It's a long-standing terror within government elected officials in the Ku Klux Klan. We've got the head of the FBI who has come out just recently to say, hey, let's face it, we have a problem of a culture of racism within the police department. And while he draws out other complexities, this is something that all citizens should step into and take on to make sure that this guy is held accountable and that the state is held up accountable for carrying it out. And that then we talk about this larger culture of white supremacy and white terror that goes on, both physical and emotional.
You know, what I found interesting was that this execution took place at the same time that report came out about lynchings.
Yes.
You know, the 4,000 lynchings between 1877 and 1950. And these executions were nothing more than a continuation of that history of terror and lynchings.
And one of the things historically that I like to look at is that when the Black Panther Party decided to arm themselves to patrol their communities and protect themselves, all of a sudden it was like a violation of laws in America. It was a violation of the culture. But the whole history of America is like white men and white organizations have been armed and active and using those weapons and demonstrating and parading with them. As soon as a black person or any other person of color takes up a weapon, then it's a violation of human rights, it's a threat to society, et cetera.
Let's shift gears for a second to another interesting development in the last week. President Raul Castro of Cuba issued a statement, a major statement, and within it, he made it very clear that Cuba was endorsing the demand of Caribbean countries for reparations. Why? What drove this? Let's leave aside for a second the merits of this, which I think that we would all say is very important. But why now? Why are the Cubans doing this?
Well, I think the realpolitik, or the pragmatic politics within the Caribbean, is that in the last 4 years or so, we've got the formation of the new community of Latin American and Caribbean nations, which involve all 33 nations, which have formed a bloc and explicitly excluded Canada and the United States out of mutual interest. Cuba has had the backing of the Caribbean, the Anglo-speaking black countries in the Caribbean against the blockade. So Cuba is showing its unity and consolidating the region. Many of the students from the Afro-Caribbean study medicine and technology and whatnot in Cuba. So this is a solidarity act. However, I think we have to probe very, very deeply. That speech also points out that Latin America as a region is the poorest region on the planet. 150 million people of African descent live in that region, 90% of them in Brazil. Most of the countries in the Caribbean are black, and Cuba is a significantly black country. So the ultimate question is not just for the support of the policies of reparation of the Caribbean countries, but what are the implications internally to Cuba for its Afro-descendant population?
Well, I was going to ask you that, but hold that point for a second. Latin America is the poorest region in the world?
That's right.
Poorer than Africa?
That's right. That's right.
So, good.
If I could just add a little bit off of what he was saying, and this is just to bring it to the Cuban population itself. The overwhelming majority of the Cuban population is African descendants. Most of the Eurocentric population fled. There is 60 years of economic boycott that has impoverished Cuba itself, and it caused a tremendous loss of wealth and growth and development. And that population in and of itself is also descendant from slaves. So I mean, there's, as James is saying, there's a direct impact of slavery on the Cuban population, and there's a direct impact of that boycott. And so reparations is one of those things that would restore Cuba and the Cuban population to health, because it's, even though it's one of the most advanced societies in the Western Hemisphere, it's still suffering the consequences of that huge economic boycott and sanction.
Right.
You know, so reparations is called for, and it's in order.
To what extent do you think that Cuban entry into this discussion about reparations will actually help to advance a movement for reparations?
Well, I think it's going to be very important. If you go back to 2001, that conference in Durham, basically, and I think Castro was there. Fidel
He
Castro
was.
was there. He spoke there, right? It was one of the leading forces in pushing the concept on the world body, and actually coming up with a resolution that said that, you know, people of color and people that had suffered from colonialism were entitled to be reimbursed. And basically the world body of people that were there came away with a collective agreement that these payments need to be made and they need to figure out how to do it. And then of course you had 9/11 and it took the wind out the sail.
Right.
And so this is a continuation in April of that movement. And so now it's revisiting us again, and most likely it's going to come up with the same conclusion because the bodies are still there.
Well, first of all, Fidel Castro gave a brilliant speech in South Africa. A number of us were there, saw it, heard it. Again, the question is, so what are the internal policies? And that's something, again, with which. But here's one of the implications. Cuba, one of the most advanced countries on all of the social indicators in the world. They're human beings. They're not God. So they've made errors and they have failures. They are now helping to leverage all of Latin America and the hemisphere and all of Africa on the question of the reparation for black people. Where will the United States of America stand? Where will Barack Obama stand?
We only have a few more minutes. There has been a report of a coup attempt in Venezuela. And I'm curious what your observations are. What do you make of this report and what are the implications?
Some of the people that were involved in it apparently had been issued U.S. visas and had fled to America or fled out of Venezuela. We are assuming that they fled to America. So I think it's a part of a destabilization campaign on the one hand. Apparently a couple weeks ago, the president of the General Assembly was accused of being associated with a drug smuggling military operation of some sort, according to one of his bodyguards that fled to America that claimed he had been working for the CIA all the time. So it seems like there's a continuing smear campaign. Earlier in the month, I believe Maduro actually accused Biden of trying to orchestrate a coup. And this, in fact, might be that coup. It might be the results of that. Other medias are not really reporting on it too much at this point. So we have to really wait and see how this play out.
I think it's a troubling sign quickly on two fronts. One, it's an indication that anti-democratic forces inside Venezuela are connected to forces outside of Venezuela, including the United States government, which has said, we will work with those Venezuelans that will work with us, which is to say there are others who really stand opposed to our policy. And so these issues of Biden and whatnot, this is troubling. They are intensifying. But the other thing I think progressives have got to ask themselves and try to get a better understanding of and engage the Venezuelan government and Venezuelan progressive citizens. What is actually going on internal to the Venezuelan? Is it as consolidated as it needs to be? I think there are signs that it is not as consolidated as it needs to be. We need to find out more about how we can collaborate to complement what they are trying to do. But it is troubling if the anti-democratic forces have been able to bring in military elements. This is the same thing that happened with Chavez. And so we have to follow this very, very closely and not just divide it between progressives in Venezuela and the anti-democratic forces outside of Venezuela. I think it's a lot more complex. And I, quite frankly, am worried. I know Maduro. I've met with him. He is a Democratic elected leader. I think we have to support him as a Democratic elected leader. But we also, in order to inform our support, must better understand what is actually going on inside the revolution. And I, quite frankly, at this point, don't have any working theories on that.
Thank you very much for this. It's a very important discussion.
Very good.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for this segment of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll be back in a moment. We're joined for this segment with Maytha Al-Hassan, who is from the University of Southern California, is a PhD student in American Studies and Ethnicity, studying historical encounters between Black internationalism and the Arab diaspora, race and ethnicity, social justice, and the arts. Al-Hassan writes and performs poetry and has worked as a performer and organizer for the play Hijabi Monologues. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
I want to jump in to discuss directly these atrocious killings that took place in Chapel Hill. And one of the things that struck me when I found out about it was how long it took for the mainstream media to get on top of this story. And it seemed to me that it was almost the result of the upsurge in Twitter that then turned into stories on CNN and elsewhere. How did you take it?
Yeah, and the next question I have is, would this have been a story if not for social media platforms that had popularized the story with hashtags and key influencers on social media outlets? Probably not, because it's not newsworthy in the sense that it doesn't fit conventional political frames that American media is used to covering, right? I mean, this is the same case with how difficult it was to get the story of a Mike Brown or an Ayanna Jones, right? If there was no social media coverage, would their story have been newsworthy? Maybe not. Only really after people protested and resisted state violence did it become a national issue and part of our national dialogue. I mean, and the other thing I definitely want to add is that there are Muslim lives who U.S. has been at the forefront of killing that never make it to national news. And those are Yemenis who have our drones bombard them, right? Or the Iraqis who we've killed upwards of maybe 1 million since we've invaded Iraq. So there still remains people who we don't allow into mainstream media.
Is there any doubt in your mind that this was a hate killing? And I say that because the police remain a bit ambiguous on this, and the White House refused to make a statement about the killings.
You know, I think it was said best by my friend and fellow Malcolm X Project researcher, Zahir Ali, that the information that was percolating was that, okay, this is a parking dispute. Okay, the killer was part of the security force of the neighborhood. Wow, this is sounding kind of familiar. These narratives and stories that start to arise and arrive in our media discourse because the facts are hard to deal with, which is that this is a violent crime that I'm possibly, okay, of course I wasn't there, so I can't jump to conclusions that this is definitely a hate crime, but it resembles everything we know to arise out of vitriolic hate. I mean, he even posted on his Facebook, I believe it was his Facebook page or one social media outlet, that he was intending to kill Muslims, and his extremely violent, deplorable views of anybody from any religious faith.
Put this in a larger context for our viewers, particularly since the September 11th terrorist attacks in 2001. There has been a real uptick in threats to Muslims and to Arabs. There have been attacks, but I don't think that the public, the non-Muslim and the non-Arab public, have any real sense of that.
Yeah, and I think you made a lot of good points that might have gone unnoticed. One is you did say non-Arab and non-Muslim, and I just want to make the point that what became popular after the killing of Dia, Yusur, and Razan, the deceased, in Chapel Hill, was this hashtag Muslim Lives Matter. And what it obscures is the fact that these are also Arabs. And I don't know if this would have happened to a white Muslim. And so I think it's really important to think about the ways that Arab and Muslim have been conflated post 9/11 and been part of our understanding of what the quote unquote terrorist looks like. Something that's really interesting, I don't know if a lot of people know, is that 2 years after 9/11, my father's car dealership was set on fire by eco-terrorists. Three young white people set my Arab Muslim father's dealership on fire, and they vandalized it. And we're not clear that it was a hate crime, but I thought it was really interesting that that's definitely not how the story was portrayed. And what this story tells too is that for the most part, Christian fundamentalists and eco-terrorism in the US far outnumbers quote unquote Muslim, or what I like to call Islamic idiom, quote unquote terrorism.
Well, you know, it's interesting that in the years since September 11th, the alleged terrorist attacks have primarily in the United States been conducted by right-wing populists,
Yep.
as opposed to anyone associated with Islam. And the same with police killings. And yet the public does not have a sense of that. They have a completely different sense and assume that terrorism equals someone that is Arab and or Muslim.
Yes, definitely. And I've, for the last 10 years, been trying to think about different ways to challenge people to see that reality, even when the hard facts are in front of them. And I think it just speaks to the power of propaganda media like Fox News, and also popular films that are possibly slated to get Oscars like American Sniper. I saw the online reaction to the film. I have not seen the film. I will disclose that. But to see that a film could motivate people to publicly acknowledge their desire to murder Arabs, who they called quote unquote ragheads in their tweets, that is fascinating that somebody would actually vocalize their desire to murder people on a social media platform. That tells me that they don't feel a threat to these sentiments at all, that these sentiments are validated, they're legitimated through the different visual and online content that they are seeing.
Let me just ask you one more question, one last question. Just recently, a report has come out about lynchings of African Americans, looking at the period of 1877 to 1950, where over 4,000 lynchings were reported and had taken place as an act of terror. How do you look at what's happening to Arabs and non-Arab Muslims in connection with the issue of domestic terror and what I'd call lynchings?
Well, I think a little known part of American history is that in the early 20th century, around the 1920s in the Deep South, Syrian Americans were also victims of lynchings. There's a case written by Sarah Gualtieri where she tries to contextualize the lynching of a Syrian grocer in Georgia in, I believe, 1926. And there were also KKK attempts at burning Syrian houses. So they were, even though Syrians were racialized as white and some of them not Muslim, they were treated in some cases as the other and included in lynching. So it's a really interesting part of our history and problematizes too this 9/11 demarcation that we sometimes like to use, that Arabs became or Muslims became non-white after 9/11. So we've constantly been vulnerable to state violence. It's the level of our visibility that's changed. We've become hyper visible in terms of national discourses and in terms of the ways state violence has enacted itself on our bodies.
Maytha Al-Hassan, thank you very much for taking this time with us on The Global African.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
And thank you for watching this episode of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll be back next time, so join us.